The wind carved its restless paths through the vast Siberian taiga, carrying flecks of snow that stung the face of the lone figure trudging through the white wilderness. He had no name to the forest, but to himself, he was simply an explorer, a man driven by an old map, a half-forgotten legend, and a hunger for silence that only the deep cold could feed. His camp was a rough circle of stones, a small fire flickering inside, more shadow than warmth. Each night, he sat cross-legged near the flames, listening to the distant howls that rose from the darkness like ghostly echoes. Sometimes he told himself they were wolves. Other times, when the wind was right, they sounded almost human, shaped like a woman's cry swallowed by the endless night. Days turned to weeks. The explorer tracked deer, read the trails of hare and fox, recorded the patterns of pine and birch, marked hidden clearings in his leather-bound journal. He began to notice things that should not be. Prints too large for any wolf, too deep for the light snow. Once, he found a patch of fresh moss carefully laid over an open snare he had set. The trap was untouched, as if someone or something had disarmed it with gentle, knowing hands. He told himself he imagined it. Isolation did strange things to the mind. But the feeling lingered. That he was not alone. That something watched him from beyond the circle of firelight, eyes that glowed when he turned too quickly, vanishing when he blinked. One evening, he awoke to silence. The fire had died to embers, the cold had crept in, but it was the absence of the forest's hum that stirred him. No branches cracked. No wind whispered. Just the faint crunch of snow, footsteps, deliberate, careful, drawing closer to the canvas flap of his tent. His heart hammered. He reached for his hunting knife. The flap shifted. Moonlight spilled in, illuminating the shape that filled the entrance. Tall, almost regal, framed in white fur that seemed to blend with the drifts behind her. The creature stepped forward, and the sight rooted him to the ground. She was a woman, mostly. Her body, curved and strong, seemed carved by the same cold that shaped the mountains. Pale skin shimmered beneath a cloak of fur that hung from her shoulders like a mane. Her hair was silver, wild, falling around her face in thick locks that caught the moonlight like frost. And her eyes, those eyes, were a predator's gold, slit pupils fixed on him with a hunger that was not entirely about food. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. She tilted her head, nostrils flaring as if tasting his scent on the stale tent air. Then she stepped closer, and he saw the ears, pointed, furred, twitching with every sound. Her nails were claws, faint but sharp, and behind her swished a thick tail, restless as a flame in wind. When he reached for his knife, she let out a soft, throaty growl. Not a threat, more a warning. Then, slowly, she lowered herself, crawling forward until her face was inches from his. He felt her breath, warm and scented faintly of pine and musk. She sniffed his neck, his shoulder, the curve of his jaw. When he flinched, she let out a soft chuff, almost a laugh, pressing her forehead to his chest as if to say, "You're mine now." He tried to speak, to ask who she was, what she wanted, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. She did not understand words. Instead, she leaned closer, her nose brushing the line of his throat, her claws tracing the edge of his collarbone with an intimacy that made his breath hitch. It was not rough. It was curious. Possessive. He shivered, and she shivered in response, a low sound in her throat that echoed with something more than animal. Her gaze locked to his again, a question he could not read but could feel in his bones. Outside, the wind picked up, howling in the distance. She raised her head, ears swiveling, eyes still pinned on him. She let out a low, answering howl, not loud, but enough to raise the hairs on his neck. Then she leaned closer, pressing her face to his neck, breathing him in deeply. When she pulled back, she nipped his shoulder, gentle but firm. A claim. The explorer did not sleep that night. He lay awake as she curled against him, her body heat a barrier against the cold, her tail coiled over his legs like a living blanket. Occasionally, she would lift her head to sniff him again, claws tracing his chest beneath his shirt, testing the edge of his warmth. When he shifted, she pressed closer, a rumble of approval in her throat. At dawn, he opened his eyes to find her gone. The flap of the tent hung loose, snow drifting in. He stumbled outside, boots crunching through the fresh powder, scanning for tracks. There, a trail of paw prints, impossibly large, leading away into the trees. But beside them, faintly, were bare footprints. Human. Her. He followed them for hours, deeper into the taiga than he had ever dared go. At times he found tufts of fur caught on low branches, signs she wanted him to follow. When he stopped, he felt eyes on him. When he pressed on, the feeling stayed behind him, a promise that she was never far. That night, he built his fire higher, the heat licking at the frozen air as he sat wrapped in his coat. He found himself glancing at the shadows between the trees, hoping to see her emerge again. When the fire burned low, he felt the familiar prickle of being watched. He turned, and there she was. This time, she did not wait at the edge of the clearing. She stepped into the light, her fur catching sparks of flame. He saw more of her now, the curve of her waist, the lines of muscle beneath pale skin, the faint scars on her thighs and shoulders that spoke of battles with beasts and men alike. She was beautiful, and terrible, and entirely beyond him. Yet she looked at him as if he was the only thing in her world. She crouched beside him, one clawed hand resting on his knee. Her nose brushed his cheek, her lips ghosting near his ear. She made a low, questioning sound, tilting her head. He dared to raise a hand, hovering over her hair. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing as he buried his fingers in the thick mane. A shiver ran through her, and through him. She liked it. Wanted it. She shifted closer, straddling his lap, her warmth seeping through the layers of his clothes. She sniffed his neck again, then pressed her lips, warm and soft, to his throat. Not quite a kiss, more an instinctive claim. He felt her tail brush his boots, curling around his leg like a binding rope. For a moment, they sat like that, man and beast, man and woman, fire crackling as the forest watched. When he met her eyes, he saw no threat, only a fierce, wordless promise, "You are mine now." And deep inside him, something stirred that he could not name, a wildness that mirrored hers. When the wind howled, she answered, her voice low, melodic, vibrating against his skin. He felt the sound more than heard it, an invitation, a warning, a vow. And though he did not understand the language of her kind, he knew what she meant. The lone explorer had come to Siberia to find silence. Instead, he found her. The forest was no longer empty. The howls were no longer distant. And deep in the endless snow, a new story was beginning, one of claws and warmth, hunger and trust, the taming of a wild thing that would never truly be tamed. As the fire died and the snow fell heavier around them, the explorer closed his eyes, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. He dreamed not of the cold, but of golden eyes watching him in the dark, waiting for him to follow wherever she might lead. At dawn, the snow fell thick and silent over the taiga, blanketing the earth in white and burying the explorer's footprints from the night before. He woke with his back stiff and his chest warm, pressed against the soft fur of the wolf woman as she slept curled over him. For a moment, he thought it was a fever dream, that his mind had conjured her out of loneliness and cold. But when he moved, her ears twitched and she lifted her head, blinking golden eyes at him, her breath misting in the frigid air. She sniffed him as if making sure he was still hers, then nuzzled under his chin, a soft rumble vibrating through her chest. It was not a greeting. It was a reaffirmation of her claim. He studied her as she stretched, watching the way her muscles moved beneath smooth, pale skin, the way her tail curled lazily behind her. She was not merely beautiful, she was savage and powerful, a living embodiment of the forest. Her hair fell around her like a silver veil, half hiding the pointed wolf ears that twitched at every sound beyond the tent. When he tried to rise, she growled softly and pressed him down with one clawed hand against his shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes told him what her voice could not: stay. Stay with me. Eventually, she let him go, rising with a fluid grace to step outside. He followed her, stumbling through knee-deep snow, his boots crunching in her silent wake. She led him to a small clearing where the sun's pale light filtered through the tall pines, illuminating the powdery snow like glittering dust. There, she turned to face him. The wolf-woman crouched low, golden eyes fixed on his. She dug her claws into the snow, tail swishing with anticipation, ears pinned back. Before he could react, she lunged forward in a blur of motion, tackling him into the drifts with a muffled thud. Snow flew around them, her weight pinning him easily to the cold earth as she sniffed along his collar, down to his chest. She licked him there, her rough tongue dragging slowly against his shirt, leaving a damp heat in its wake. His breath hitched, but he dared not move. Her gaze flicked up to his, narrowing in satisfaction. She pressed her nose to his cheek, inhaling deeply, her claws kneading his shoulders in a way that was not quite painful, but filled with dominance. Then she shifted her hips forward, straddling him fully, tail curling around his thigh. She made a low, throaty sound, almost a purr, as she ground her hips against his belt, testing his reaction. He closed his eyes, the cold forgotten under her weight and heat. When he opened them again, she was staring down at him, hair falling over her face, breath misting between parted lips. She leaned down and bit his shoulder lightly, teeth pressing against his coat but never breaking skin. A possessive mark. Then she rose suddenly, leaving him gasping in the snow. She turned away, looking over her shoulder with a flick of her ears, beckoning him with a low growl. Shaking, he stood, following her as she led him deeper into the forest. They walked for hours. At times, she would stop to sniff the air, ears twitching at distant sounds. Other times, she would crouch to brush aside snow, revealing hidden caches of mushrooms or frozen berries that she dug out with delicate claws, placing them into his hands with a satisfied huff. When midday came, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a wide river frozen solid under a thick sheet of ice. The wolf-woman crouched at the edge, sniffing the wind. Suddenly she lunged forward, plunging her arm into a hole in the ice, claws slicing through slush and freezing water. When she pulled back, a fat silver fish thrashed in her grip. She turned to him, golden eyes gleaming with triumph, and tossed it at his feet. He understood. This was a gift. An offering. Or perhaps proof, that she could provide for him as she expected him to provide for her. He cleaned the fish by the frozen river, hands numb and shaking, while she sat nearby watching him intently, tail curled neatly around her legs. As he prepared the small fire to roast it, she moved closer, pressing herself against his side. He felt the warmth of her bare skin through his thick coat. Her head rested on his shoulder, and she made a soft, vibrating sound in her chest, a sound that made something inside him tighten with unfamiliar heat. The scent of pine and musk clung to her hair as it brushed against his cheek. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was language enough. That evening, as the sky darkened to violet, she led him to a cave hidden behind a curtain of fir branches. Inside, the floor was layered with dry pine needles and moss, carefully arranged into a sleeping nest. He realized she had prepared this long before he arrived, as if she had been waiting. The wolf-woman pushed him gently into the nest, straddling his hips again, claws pressing into his chest as she sniffed him thoroughly. Her nose brushed under his jaw, then lower, along the lines of his neck to his collarbone. She let out a low, pleased rumble, tail swishing behind her with slow, deliberate motions. When he reached up to touch her cheek, she froze, ears flicking back. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment he feared he had crossed a boundary. But then she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as his gloved fingers brushed her skin. Her tail flicked faster, thumping softly against his boots. She opened her eyes again and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, exploratory kiss, roughened by her inhuman warmth and feral scent. She pulled back, staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Her fingers curled around his wrists, pinning them to the mossy bed, claws digging lightly into his skin. She leaned close, her nose brushing his ear, and made a low, husky sound that vibrated deep in her chest. It was not a word, but it spoke clearly, mine. That night, they lay together in the cave as the blizzard howled outside. He felt her tail drape over his legs, felt her warmth press to his side, her claws resting lightly on his chest as if to ensure he would not leave. When he drifted into sleep, he dreamed of golden eyes glowing in darkness, of silver hair sweeping over his skin like snow, of her soft, rumbling growl vibrating against his throat. At dawn, she was awake before him, sitting at the cave entrance, watching the rising sun. Her silhouette was regal and wild, framed by falling snow. She turned to him as he stirred, ears flicking forward, eyes softening. Then she crawled back into the nest and pressed her face to his neck, inhaling deeply before pulling away to lick his jaw in a rough, affectionate stroke. She rose and beckoned him again with a flick of her tail. There was something urgent in her movements now, something purposeful. Today, she would show him more of her world. Today, she would take him hunting. They traveled west, deeper into territory he had never mapped, over jagged ridges and through silent birch groves. Each step he took felt as if he were sinking deeper into her realm, leaving the human world behind. The wolf woman moved with silent grace beside him, golden eyes scanning the shadows, tail flicking with anticipation. By midday, they reached a frozen meadow where a herd of elk grazed among the knee-deep snow, tearing away strips of lichen from the buried rocks. The wolf woman crouched low, her ears flattening, her breath coming in silent puffs. She turned to him, meeting his eyes, and nodded once. He understood. This was her hunt, but it was also his test. They stalked together, her steps silent as shadow, his careful and clumsy. When he slipped and crunched the snow, she flicked her tail against his leg in reprimand. Closer, closer, until he saw the massive bull elk, steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. The wolf woman shifted her weight, claws digging into the snow, muscles coiling. Then she sprang. A blur of silver and white, her claws sank into the bull's neck as her teeth snapped at its shoulder. It reared, bellowing in rage, but she clung on with savage grace, ripping it down with her weight. He watched, stunned, as she tore into it, swift and clean. Her face was splattered with blood, eyes blazing with primal triumph. She turned to him, chest heaving, lips parted around sharp white teeth. Slowly, she crawled to him across the snow, the blood steaming on her skin, dripping down her chest to stain the pale curves beneath her fur mantle. She pressed her forehead to his, growling softly, and he felt her breath hot against his face. In that moment, he realized she was not just a beast. She was a huntress, a queen of this frozen kingdom, and she had chosen him. Not as prey, but as mate. She pulled him into her arms, claws scratching lightly at his back, her scent flooding his senses, blood, musk, pine, and the sharp metallic bite of winter. He shivered, not from cold, but from the wildness that pulsed between them. That night, they ate together by the remains of the elk, seated on pine boughs beside a roaring fire. She curled against his side, tail wrapped tightly around them both, eyes half closed as he stroked her hair. Each time his fingers brushed her wolf ears, she let out a low, rumbling purr of pleasure, pressing closer, her breathing deepening with hidden desire. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and merciless in the clear night sky. But beneath them, in the flickering glow of firelight, the wolf woman and her chosen mate lay entwined, their hearts beating in tandem with the pulse of the silent, endless forest. And as sleep claimed him once more, the explorer dreamed not of home, nor warmth, nor civilization. But only of her, and of the unknowable world she carried in her golden eyes. When dawn broke, the wolf woman was already awake, crouched by the mouth of their cave. Her golden eyes gleamed beneath the slanted rays of morning sun, focused on the drifting snowflakes that sparkled like diamond dust. She turned to the explorer as he stirred under his heavy blankets, and a slow smile curved her lips, showing the tips of her sharp canines. She rose and padded toward him, her bare feet silent against the frozen ground. He watched her approach, studying every detail, the soft sway of her silver hair, the curve of her hips, the thick tail that flicked languidly behind her. Her body moved with lethal grace, every muscle honed for survival, yet her eyes held a softness reserved only for him. She knelt beside his bedding, sniffing him deeply before pressing her nose into the crook of his neck. Her rough tongue dragged along his skin, a waking greeting that sent shivers down his spine. Then she nipped his earlobe lightly, growling under her breath in a way that felt both affectionate and commanding. When he rose, she circled him slowly, inspecting his clothing and gear, tugging at straps and belts with curious fingers. Finally, she seized his coat and pulled him forward, gesturing urgently toward the snowy trail beyond the cave. Today, she had plans, and he would follow. They walked until the sun hovered high above the skeletal birch branches. The wolf-woman moved ahead, cutting a path with effortless strides, her furred tail swishing through the drifts. At times, she glanced back to ensure he kept pace, ears flicking impatiently if he stumbled. Finally, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast, frozen lake shrouded in morning mist. She crouched low at the edge, ears swiveling. Her nostrils flared as she scented the air, golden eyes narrowing. Without warning, she dropped to all fours and crawled forward, nose pressed against the snow. He followed slowly, trying to see what she tracked. Suddenly, she froze, muscles coiling like drawn steel. Then she lunged into the mist, her claws slicing through the frost-covered reeds. A moment later, she emerged, dragging a massive Arctic hare clamped between her teeth. Blood stained her lips as she approached him, chest heaving with exertion, eyes alight with triumph. She dropped the hare at his feet and sat back on her haunches, panting lightly, her tail sweeping wide behind her. When he did not immediately react, she growled low, baring her teeth slightly in reprimand. He knelt, running his fingers along the hare's soft fur, and glanced up at her. "Thank you," he whispered, unsure if she understood his words. But her ears flicked forward and her gaze softened, so he repeated it, louder this time. "Thank you." She rose and stepped closer, pressing her forehead against his, her claws curling lightly over his shoulders. Her breath came hot and ragged between them, and he felt her chest rise and fall against his own. Her scent filled his lungs, wild musk, pine needles, and faint traces of blood. Arousal stirred low in his belly, and she sensed it instantly. With a throaty growl, she shoved him back into the snow, straddling his thighs with her knees buried deep into the drifts. Her claws raked lightly down his chest, not breaking the thick coat but sending jolts of sensation through him. She bent low, sniffing his neck and jaw before licking him there, her rough tongue leaving hot trails against the cold. Then she leaned back and studied him, golden eyes narrowed with an unreadable intent. Slowly, deliberately, she unhooked the fur mantle from her shoulders, letting it slide down her arms to reveal her smooth skin beneath. She was breathtaking. A perfect blend of woman and wolf, with pale curves interrupted only by the faint streak of fur along her spine and the thick, luxurious tail that curled around her thigh. She pressed her hands to his chest, pinning him to the snow, and rolled her hips forward in a slow, testing motion. Heat pooled between them despite the biting cold. She growled softly, a low sound that rumbled through his bones, then bent down to press her lips to his ear. "Mine," her body whispered, even if her mouth spoke no words. After a moment, she rose and pulled him to his feet with surprising strength. She gestured toward the mist-shrouded lake, ears flicking forward with determination. Today would not be spent in their cave. Today, she would teach him her ways. They crossed the frozen lake, her claws tapping lightly against the ice while his boots crunched with each hesitant step. Beyond it lay a dense pine forest, ancient and silent, where the snow fell in perpetual drifts from high branches. The wolf-woman moved like a spirit through the trees, never disturbing the quiet, pausing only to sniff at tree trunks or rub her scent against low-hanging boughs. When he stumbled into a hidden drift, sinking waist-deep, she turned with a scolding growl and seized his coat collar, hauling him out with ease. Her claws dug lightly into his skin through the layers, and when he gasped in surprise, she pressed her face to his neck, inhaling deeply. Her nose brushed his ear, and he felt the warmth of her open mouth, her breath shaking with an emotion that felt too primal to name. That evening, they found a small clearing ringed by towering black spruces. The wolf woman crouched low, sniffing the snow, then turned to him with a look of quiet challenge. She pointed to his hunting knife, then to the forest beyond, her tail flicking with impatience. He hesitated, understanding dawning slowly. She would hunt with him, but he must prove he could hunt for her. Hours passed as the pale winter sun slid toward the horizon. His hands shook with cold, sweat freezing against his skin beneath his coat. Each snapped branch sounded like thunder in the stillness, but the wolf woman moved silently beside him, ears twitching at every sound. Finally, he saw it, a small snow grouse pecking among frozen berries. He raised his arms slowly, the knife trembling in his grip. The wolf woman crouched beside him, her tail sweeping slowly over the snow, her eyes locked on the bird. When he threw, his aim was true. The blade pierced the grouse cleanly through the neck, and it fell with only a soft flutter. She lunged forward and snatched it up, tail wagging once in delighted approval. When she turned to him, her eyes shone with fierce pride. She pressed her lips to his, kissing him hard, her claws tangling in his hair. When she pulled back, she bit his lower lip lightly, her golden eyes half-lidded with desire. Together, they skinned and roasted the bird by a small fire. She sat curled around him as they ate, pressing her warm body against his side. Each time he brought a piece of meat to her lips, she nipped his fingers playfully, her wolf ears flicking with pleasure. When darkness fell, she dragged him onto a nest of pine needles she had arranged under a spruce bough. She straddled his hips, her silver hair falling around them like a silken curtain. The cold air steamed around their mingled breaths as she bent to lick his throat, growling softly each time he trembled beneath her. She pressed her claws lightly into his shoulders, not enough to break the skin, but enough to remind him of her strength. Her tail wrapped around his waist, flicking slowly, brushing against him in rhythmic, teasing motions. Each time he reached to touch her, she growled softly and pushed his hands back down, asserting her dominance. Yet her eyes remained soft, half-lidded with desire and something deeper. Something like trust. When she finally lay down against his chest, her breath came slow and deep, and she curled around him protectively, her tail wrapping them both in warmth. They fell asleep under the silent stars, the frozen forest holding its breath around them. And in the deepest hours of night, he woke to feel her claws combing gently through his hair, her golden eyes watching him with a fierce tenderness that burned hotter than any fire. The frost-laden forest seemed to breathe around them as they moved together, their bodies and hearts bound in a silent rhythm. The explorer felt the wolf woman's presence with every step, the brush of her fur against his arm, the steady thump of her tail wrapped around his waist, the warm pulse of her breath mingling with his own. Days melted into nights beneath the icy canopy, and their connection deepened beyond mere survival. Without words, she taught him the language of the wild. How to read the subtle shifts in wind and shadow, how to track unseen prey, how to move like a whisper through the frozen world. Each lesson was an intimate dance, her claws teasing and sometimes pressing into his skin, a firm reminder of her dominance, yet tempered with a tenderness that unsettled him. One evening, as the pale sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the snowy ground, they reached a frozen waterfall. The crystal cascades hung like jagged glass, shimmering under the amber light. The wolf woman approached it with reverence, tracing the ice with delicate fingers tipped in sharp claws. She turned to him with a mischievous glint in her golden eyes and beckoned. Slowly, deliberately, she began to shed her outer layers, revealing the pale curves beneath, skin kissed by moonlight and streaked faintly with silver fur along her spine. The cold bit at her, but she seemed untouched, an elemental force woven from frost and desire. With a soft growl, she pulled him close, pressing her body against his, the sharp contrast between her warmth and the biting air igniting a fire within him. Her claws grazed his chest as she lowered herself onto him, hips moving with slow, sinuous grace. Their breaths mingled, a smoky haze swirling between them as her tail curled possessively around his legs. She whispered no words, yet every movement spoke volumes, the promise of wild abandon, the tether of possession, the push and pull of primal hunger tempered by quiet trust. Afterward, nestled in a nest of pine needles near the waterfall's base, she traced patterns along his skin with claws soft as feathers. Her golden eyes locked with his, a silent vow. This was their world now, a world where boundaries blurred and only the raw pulse of desire and survival remained. The next morning, they journeyed deeper, facing harsher winds and treacherous ice. Yet every challenge only forged their bond stronger. He learning to surrender, she learning to trust. When the cold pierced their bones, she would press herself closer, her body a furnace that banished the chill. On a night when the aurora painted the sky in swirling greens and purples, she led him to a hidden glade. There, beneath the shimmering lights, she shed her remaining layers and danced, a wild, fluid motion of fur and flesh that mesmerized him. He reached for her, trembling with longing, and she accepted him with fierce, unspoken consent. Their union beneath the northern lights was a testament to their shared wildness, raw, intimate, and filled with a delicate power. Her claws traced delicate patterns on his back, her breath hot against his ear, her tail wrapping possessively around him. As dawn crept over the horizon, they lay entwined, bound by ice and flesh, their hearts beating in unison with the endless Siberian wild. The forest had grown darker and colder as the long Siberian night deepened, but the fire they'd kindled burned bright and warm between them. The explorer watched the wolf woman as she moved around their camp with a wild grace, silver hair catching flickers of orange light, golden eyes gleaming with fierce intensity. Tonight was different. He could feel it in the electric tension that crackled between them, the way her claws traced slow, deliberate paths along his arms, the way her tail curled tighter around his waist. She no longer hesitated, no longer just tested him, but claimed him in ways both subtle and profound. She knelt before him, eyes locked onto his, lips parting just slightly, revealing those sharp canines, teeth gleaming in the firelight. Then, without a word, she pushed him back gently, but with an unmistakable dominance, onto the bed of pine needles they'd gathered. Her hands were strong and sure as they moved over his body, stripping away the last layers of clothing. The cold air hit his bare skin, but her breath was hot and close, a balm against the Siberian chill. Her claws danced over him, not threatening, but possessive, marking him like a prize. She straddled him, hips moving with slow, deliberate rhythm that teased and demanded, every motion a silent command. Her tail wrapped tightly around his legs, a tether binding them in mutual surrender. His heart pounded in his chest as her golden eyes bore into his soul, conveying a fierce protectiveness and an unyielding hunger. The wolf woman's voice was a low growl, an ancient sound that stirred something deep within him, a call to wild abandon. She nipped softly along his collarbone, her tongue tracing fiery paths across chilled skin. Her claws pressed gently into his shoulders, reminding him of her strength, her primal nature. He reached up to cup her face, fingers trembling as they traced the delicate fur along her jawline. She leaned into his touch, a shiver running through her body that made the firelight flicker and dance across her curves. Their bodies moved in perfect harmony, the frozen wilderness around them fading away until only the heat of their union remained. The wolf woman's growls blended with his gasps, a symphony of desire that echoed beneath the towering pines. After long hours, spent wrapped in each other's arms beneath the Siberian stars, they lay intertwined, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Her tail brushed against his chest in slow, languid strokes as she rested her head on his shoulder, eyes half closed in contentment. In that quiet moment, they were no longer just explorer and wild creature, but something new, a fused entity of flesh and spirit, bound by ice and fire, strength and surrender, wilderness and passion. As dawn's first light broke through the trees, the wolf woman whispered a growl close to his ear. A promise that this was only the beginning of their shared journey, a journey forged in the depths of the Siberian wild and sealed by their unbreakable bond.